Hey Adventures, so this is a video that I've been meaning to do for months now, like around 7 months, and I forgot about it, forgot that I was planning on doing it. I was reminded about it because I just put up my review for Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, first book in the Belgariad series, and in it I mentioned that I was wanting to do a video about classic fantasy and that term and what that means and stuff like that, and that I was piggybacking off of a video from Liam's Lyceum, and so I'll have that linked, so make sure you go watch that because his video I'm going to be referencing quite a bit in my own video here, but also I think that he does a great job at explaining his own thoughts on this, and so I want to point you towards that because I think I'm getting a lot of information and definitely am inspired to a large degree by what he was saying in that. So first thing that I want to talk about though is like this term of classic fantasy and what does it mean and how do people refer to it, because there's really part of the problem with this term is the fact that there is no consensus about what classic fantasy is. People say, oh, you know it when you hear it or whatever. That's kind of the idea that they give. Whether anybody's actually said that or not, it doesn't really matter. That's kind of the idea that's given is, oh, it's classic fantasy. Well, what does that actually mean? Because there's so many different variations on what that term classic can possibly mean. So of course, there's a lot of people who say, "Oh, it's old fantasy. It's fantasy that's fairly old, but it's still popular or whatever." And there's definitely a aspect of that. Some of the definitions that I was finding online were things like surviving the test of time and remaining culturally relevant across generations. Well, what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? What is surviving the test of time? What is remaining culturally relevant across that's kind of a little bit of a definition, but it doesn't really explain anything. We also have a book accepted as being exemplary or particularly noteworthy, usually of some chronological age since its original publication. Again, gives no clear indication of what actually classic fantasy would fall under. And that's just me looking at the term classic in regards to a book. And so it applies across genres rather than just specifically to fantasy, but nonetheless. So what would make something old enough to be a classic? I've heard many, like this is one of the primary aspects that people incorporate in when they're describing classic fantasy or a book that's considered classic fantasy is that it's old. What does old mean though? A lot of people, of course, you reference Tolkien, and we'll get to that in a second here. But what is old enough to be a classic? Like how many years is old enough to be a classic? I've heard 20, I've heard 25, I've heard 50, I've heard all these different numbers. And so what actually makes something a classic? Are we following the same rules for antique, which is an antique I believe is 20 years old at this point, which is crazy because that's things I'm antique at that point by that definition. Things that were built after I was born are now antiques and stuff like that. And so I kind of don't like that definition at all because it doesn't feel accurate. And so anyways, I don't necessarily particularly like having the age as a standard for whether something's a classic or not, which I think is where we get into things like surviving the test of time, meaning it's still relevant, which is what some of these things were saying, relevant across generations. Is it classic in the sense that it was fantasy written in the classical period? Well, what's the classical period? Are we talking about classic antiquity like ancient Rome and ancient Greece? Is that what we're talking about when we're talking about written in the classic period? Or are we talking about the classical period for music, which was like roughly 1750 to 1820-ish, and then set between the Baroque and Romantic periods? Like, is that the classic period that we're talking about? Or one of the many other classic periods? So that again doesn't really help or benefit us in this conversation because there's no clear indication of what we're talking about. Is it classic as in Tolkien-esque? And I think this is what most people are trying to refer to, but what even is Tolkien-esque? And that's a good point that Liam goes into in his video, is kind of how you should describe things, and I'll get a little bit more to that in a second here. But Tolkien-esque, what does that even mean? Because there's a lot of different aspects to Tolkien that are not just quest fantasy, although that's a major aspect, that's a major portion of the story. Is it the magical MacGuffin? Is that what makes something a classic fantasy, or the Fellowship, or the Dark Lord trope, or any of these other clear good versus evil, light side and dark side? Like, what exactly makes something classic just from being Tolkien-esque? What even is Tolkien-esque? Is it because it's got dwarves and dragons and elves and these generic fantasy races? Maybe, but I don't know that that's even enough to call something Tolkien-esque, because I've definitely read stories that have these fantasy races, but they feel nothing at all like Tolkien. So how can you say that they're Tolkien-esque? So anyways, this is all just set up to say that this is a very confusing mess of a term that really isn't very beneficial, which is kind of Liam's point as well. Liam talks in his video about being prescriptive versus descriptive and stuff like that, and he prescribes that we should be more descriptive in the way that we describe and explain this term, or what we're referring to when we're talking about classic fantasy. Meaning he wants us to explain how it's similar to other things. This is the sort of thing that it reads like. It reminds me of Tolkien in the way that it's inspired by Northern myth and legend. It was something that one of the examples that Liam used in his video, and there's plenty of other examples as well. That was just one of them, but that's something that is a lot more beneficial. It reminds me of Tolkien because of this. Now we know exactly what we're looking for. Now we know exactly what we're expecting when we're getting into it. But he also talks about adding some more adjectives, adding some more description when we're describing, instead of just saying classic fantasy. What if we said classic sword and sorcery, or classic epic fantasy? Then we have a whole lot more, just by adding that one adjective to describe the term. We now have a whole lot better understanding of what's actually being discussed here, and what it all means, in order for us to, or when we're describing classic fantasy, what does that term mean? Because now we're getting a lot more specific with it. Liam and I have talked a lot about this, and we had a good conversation right around the time that he was making his video, and I was thinking about this as well. One of the things that we discussed was that comparisons can be useful. This book feels like this book because, and we see a lot of that with things like the next Game of Thrones, or whatever. You know, that's the sort of thing that you see so often on book covers, and those comparisons aren't always very beneficial now, because it's just kind of diluted what that means at this point. But I want to read some of the notes that I wrote down in our conversations to Liam, because I think it's easier for me to just read them rather than try and explain myself and stumble through my own explanation. Let's see. I tend to think most people use the term to refer to fantasy from Tolkien until the modern age, which again, that's another term that needs to be understood, but that's basically Harry Potter and the 2000s, which doesn't always apply, because Wheel of Time is considered classic fantasy, and it overlaps that time period of modern fantasy and classic fantasy, and before Harry Potter and such. So that's kind of also a very messy line, but there's somewhat more of an understanding of, this is kind of what I think people are trying to say when they're using the phrase classic fantasy. Either that, or the Tolkien-esque fantasy with elves, dwarves, etc., based off of Tolkien's works. So things that are heavily inspired, Shannara or Belgariad even to some degree, though I wouldn't say that that's so much a ripoff. There's some other things that are very derivative of Lord of the Rings. Even Wheel of Time is very derivative of Lord of the Rings, especially in that first book, The Eye of the World. But then there's also people like me who use it to describe the idea of classic in the definition of classic, which I believe is 25 plus years, at least according to some people. So like, again, I'm incorporating the nuance into my own discussions with Liam, because I understand that it's a mess, that people don't even agree with what classic means in terms of an age limit, as well as meaning a book that's read and reread over and over again, and that is almost universally acclaimed. That's something that I've heard for a long time, is a classic is a book that you go back to and reread over and over again. And I think that's a fairly good definition, but there's modern books that I've read that I would go back and reread over and over again, and I wouldn't consider them classics, even though I love them, even though they're fantastic. Part of that's because they're not old enough to be classics, but part of that is also that they're too niche, I guess. I'm the one who would reread them over and over again, not the general public. But then I also think about, there's a lot of old books that would be considered classics, or are, and the series that I'm going to use as an example here is the Leatherstocking Tales by James Fenimore Cooper. People would consider The Last of the Mohicans a classic. That one's super well read, but most people don't even realize that there's 4 other books in the series. So how can you say that all 4 of them are classics, even though they're all of the same series, all super old, all super good, but only one of them is remembered, maybe 2? And so that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with here, because if one book in the series is considered a classic, but the series as a whole isn't, but the one book is reread over and over again, and all the other books are super old, like what makes something a classic even in that sense? And so that's, again, it's just feeding into the confusion more than actually helping. I have noticed that I'll also try to reference other books that would be similar to them, like I did with Way of Adan, but that at least hopefully gives people a bit more of an idea of what I'm meaning with the term. And so that's me referencing back to my review of The Way of Adan that I put out, where I was talking about some of these other books that it felt very similar to, that I felt like were maybe not necessarily influences, but were possibly influences, possibly homages, something like that, where they felt very similar in my mind to what they felt, what The Way of Adan was. So anyways, that's all that's to say that I tend to agree with Liam that the term classic fantasy is worthless. It's basically not helpful because there's no clear indication of what that term actually means. And all this to say, this is the whole point of this video. This is what I was building to. I'll be changing to traditional fantasy as the term that I use in describing books that previously I would have called classic fantasy. I'm calling them traditional fantasy because when it comes to fantasy, and this is specifically when it comes to fantasy in the vein of Tolkien, with elves, dwarves, dragons, etc., that kind of Tolkien-esque is what I'm going to be calling traditional fantasy, because it follows that tradition that was set by Tolkien. We call him the father or the grandfather of fantasy for a reason. Like that's that tradition that was kind of solidified by Tolkien. He didn't start it, but it was kind of solidified by him. That's what I'm referring to if you ever hear me talk about the term traditional fantasy from now on. And I'll also use that for things like Belgariad, which isn't so much... okay, so here's some... Belgariad is a good example. Doesn't have the elves and dwarves and dragons in the same way that Tolkien's Middle-earth does, although there is some degree of that. But if I'm talking about like Dawn of Wonder, which is one that Liam brought up, or if I'm talking about Collation Saga, which is heavily influenced by, as well as Andrew D. Meredith's Needle and Leaf, those are both, because Andrew D. Meredith is so influenced by Belgariad, those are books that I would consider in that same vein, in that same tradition, and so I would consider them traditional fantasy, and I would do the same thing with Dawn of Wonder. I'd do the same thing with so many other books that I have talked about and that I tend to like. So that's kind of what I'm getting at when I am using the term traditional fantasy, and I'm going to kind of phase out classic fantasy from my vocabulary, from the things that I tend to use when talking about and describing books. I believe I heard this term from Josh at Red Fury Books, which is interesting because Liam also in his video referenced Red Fury Books, a video that he had done, and so we're kind of both coming from a lot of the same angles and for a lot of the same reasons at the same time. So yeah, I believe I heard Josh use that term of traditional fantasy, and I really like it. I really think that it fits a lot better than classic fantasy. It's a little bit more, it's still very, very broad, and it still doesn't have a very distinct definition, but it's a little bit more focused than classic fantasy. And so that's kind of what I'm going with. And it's, when I use that term again, it's specifically because I'm referring back to the tradition that was solidified by Tolkien. So anyways, that is my video on what is classic fantasy. That's the title that I went with for this one, and that's kind of my thoughts. This has been a long time in coming, but I'm glad that I was able to actually finally get it filmed and put out. So anyways, thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and our social media is linked in the description down below. We'll see you guys again soon. Stay warm.